Hello and welcome back to another episode of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. We are currently in part 2 of my interview with Daniel Miller. In part 1, Daniel talked about his experience growing up in the church in Rigby, Idaho, serving his mission in Tokyo, Japan, and then coming home and marrying his wife, AnnaMarie. Is that her name?
Yep.
And an experience that he had sort of thinking that he'd received revelation about a child being born and then having that revelation turn out a little different than he thought. It's a great episode and I'm really glad we did it. Talks a lot about kind of what it's like to grow up in the church in Rigby, Idaho. Was it the 80s that you were growing up? Is that in the 80s, and super interesting. So we are now going to turn to Daniel's time working for LDS Church headquarters. As I mentioned in the previous episode, Daniel worked for 2 years as a program manager in the Publishing Services Department, where he oversaw all media production for Seminary and Institutes, including the CES portfolio and broadcasts. And so we're going to be skipping a lot of stuff, Daniel, in your life, but why don't we just talk about how you came to, work for the church, and we'll talk about what it was like for you.
Yeah, so I remember at my previous job, prior to going to work for the church, that there was one of my coworkers that I kept talking to, and I was experiencing kind of some severe burnout. Been there for 7 years and just wasn't having much job satisfaction, and kept going into this coworker's office and telling him, I just feel like there's something else I'm supposed to be doing. I don't know what it is.
What was your general career?
So I worked in the mortgage industry, mortgage technology industry for a company in Idaho.
So how many
Idaho
years
Falls.
had you worked, how many years had you been in the workforce by that time?
So at that position, I had been in 7 years in that role. I did work for another 5 or 6 years as a manager of the jewelry store.
Okay.
And then went back to college. So I worked, then went back to college, and then went back into the workforce.
And were you a multimedia guy? Were you a computer programmer guy? What were you by the time you went to work for the church?
I had a lot of, with my previous job, had a lot of experience in project management.
Okay.
Which is what they were looking for. So there's a certification that you can get called the PMP certification, which requires a 4-year college degree and 4,500 hours of documented past project management experience. And I had that certification, which is a requirement for program managers, project managers that work for the church, that if you don't have it, you have to get that certification to work there. So I had already had that, so that was part of what I guess the allure was for them to hire me in. They have 3 different levels. They have 4. They have a project coordinator. They have a program manager 1, program manager 2, and program manager 3, and each have different pay scales and whatnot. And they hired me right in as a program manager 3. So I kind of came in already with a little bit of seniority.
So what's it like to interview at church headquarters?
A couple of really interesting experiences like that. I do remember that I was supposed to be traveling with my work, and I had gotten to the airport, and I traveled so much with my past work, kind of had it down to a science. Well, I had a flight that I was supposed to get to. I get to the airport and I go through the kiosks to print my tickets and check in and do all the stuff. Doesn't work. I move to the next kiosk. Doesn't work. I go up to the front counter. Idaho Falls is a small podunk airport. There's nobody even at the counter, and I'm dinging on the bell. Finally, the lady comes out and she punches in on the computer and says, "Oh, I'm sorry, it's 6:01. You can't check in. You had to check in by 6 o'clock." And I lost it. I had to be somewhere important for work, and I lost it. I was so mad at the lady, explaining I'd already gone through this, and she's basically, "Sorry, there's nothing I can do." And I remember the drive home, super upset, probably cursing in my mind and replaying the conversation over and over. Well, I go home, I rebook my flight, but now I have to get a rental car and drive to Salt Lake and catch a flight from there. I'm thinking how big of a pain it's going to be and whatever. So I get all that booked. I get all of it done. I'm sitting on the bed, and I think I'm eating a bowl of cereal on the bed, and my phone rings, and I answer it, and it's the, what do they call it? The guy, the recruiter for the church, and says, "Hey, we'd like you to come and on site and I'd done several phone interviews prior to that, but he says, we'd like you to actually come on site. Can you come today or tomorrow and meet with people?" And I'm like, are you kidding me? My flight, miraculously, I'm thinking this was a miracle. This was God's plan. He made me miss my flight. Now I have to drive to Salt Lake. If I leave now, I'll have plenty of time between when I get there to do the interview for when I have to be to the Salt Lake airport to fly out. So I'm like, wow, God's really guiding me. And I was really feeling like I'm going to get this job as the numbers dwindle down. And I do remember that I applied right on the church website for it. I didn't know anybody there. And they show you the number of people that have applied for that position. And there was 250 something people that applied. And at first I'm thinking, no way, right? Not going to happen. And then as the interviews went on, and they kept telling me you're now down to the top 10 and whatever. And now you're in the top 3. And so I remember my first time showing up to do the interview. They had the manager of that department, which happened to be for family history and church history, was the manager of that entire portfolio. And she brought in at least 2 other project managers that were already employed there. And I showed up and I had my full suit on and whatnot, but I had like a dark colored, almost like a rust colored shirt on. And as soon as I got there and sat and saw everybody in the white shirts and whatnot, I was like, crap, I should have worn a white shirt. And I was really, really stressed about that and thought that probably killed my chances right there. And I had a good laugh after it with the manager. She said, yeah, you probably don't want to show up in a rust colored shirt, but it wasn't that big of a deal. But I remember I was really super nervous because I had all these people just in a conference room doing the interviews with me. And but they were very friendly, very personal, and just kind of went over my resume and asked me about some experience. Very, very laid back and very casual. And overall, I thought it was kind of fun. And I left there feeling like, you know what, I could see myself working with these people. They all have great personalities and they seem kind of fun. And I'm kind of excited for it.
Did you view it as like working for the Lord, basically? How did you think of it?
Yeah, at the time, not knowing, I mean, it kind of felt like, yeah, this is just another calling almost, except now I get paid for this calling in a way. I just felt like it was going to be a very spiritual. Prior to that, I wouldn't say that I was super active. We would go, but I just, I always felt like the church is true. I always felt like, I need to get my life back on the path. I'd start being more engaged and active and callings and, doing more of that. But I just was kind of lax, just kind of keeping my head down and flying under the radar and not really engaged in it. And, my wife was very, very spiritual, wanted to be much more active in the church. So I felt like, this is a way that she and I can kind of make sure that we're on the same page. Is now that I'm in the mix of it, it'll be good. And it was great.
And you were how old at the time you went to work for the church?
Late 30s.
Okay. And this is around 2011, right?
Yeah, 2011.
Okay. So that's about 4 years ago. All right. So you interview, you get the job. And go ahead and describe what you were hired to do.
Yeah, so I was hired, first of all, to work for the family history, church history department. And my original office was actually at the motion picture studio in Provo. And you drive onto the motion picture studio area there. They ran out of office space for the employees there. And so they purchased a couple of houses just at the end of the property and then kind of merged that in. So I actually worked in the living room, had some kind of desks set up for, let's see, 1, 2, 3, probably 4 or 5 of us, 6 of us there. And just right in the living room, Had a TV up on the wall that you could throw in some church videos or whatnot while you worked. And I got to wear jeans and a polo shirt to work every day, very casual in that area, and would go to the corporate office or the church office building once or twice a week when there was meetings with the stakeholders and whatnot. But for the most part, I just went there and hung out with the crew.
And so you were doing what during that early time?
Yeah, so during that time, I was doing the same type of stuff, the program management stuff. Where I was new, I wasn't running the entire portfolio, right? They're giving me smaller projects to kind of give my feet wet. So there was some revisions to some church history manuals that were being done that I worked with. There was they were talking about putting kiosks in the church history library where people could come in, and we were recording the videos for those and going through some of that stuff. Just really small projects, print type things, brochures, pamphlets, announcements for upcoming church history events when they would do different things, and the flyers and the posters and a lot of that stuff that were just really super small projects so that I could get my feet wet.
Okay, and then what'd you end up doing?
So then I think I kind of got my feet wet, and one of the first bigger projects I worked on was a podcast series called 5 Minute Genealogy, and that was for the Family History Department, and you can look online on Google. They have them all over on Google. There was 20-something episodes. I think we did 5-minute episodes that teach you how to go from knowing nothing about how to do genealogy work all the way through becoming an expert and being able to find your own name. And the whole concept was find a name in 5 minutes. And so it took 5 minutes to do it, which is ironic, but so we did that podcast series. That was probably my first introduction to the correlation department, was at that time. I don't know if you want to go into that.
Quick question. I think Mormonism probably has the most robust podcast presence or network of many world religions. Now, I don't know that to be sure, but I just suspect that there are few religions with as many podcasts that are as intense as we have. Did you at the time? Do you think the church had a sense for the breadth and depth of podcasts that were out there? And were you aware at the time?
I don't think that I was necessarily aware, because I really wasn't big into podcasting, but there was definitely surveying. I mean, there are people that are out there that are looking for what the hot items are, what the hot apps are, types of apps, what the hot websites or look and feel. I remember we'd spend time as we're trying to come up with concepts of what videos recently have gone viral on YouTube. And we would spend time in meetings going over the viral videos and, look at this ESPN video, and we should do something along these lines, and really trying to find what was the viral videos so that we could reproduce that on our end. And we definitely spent time doing market research, I guess you could call it, on that.
But you didn't get a sense that, because I've always thought maybe the church would want to stay away from doing podcasts, because it would, if they start promoting podcasts amongst the membership, then the members are going to find out about maybe podcasts the church wouldn't want them learning about. But you never got that sense.
No, I don't think so. And when I look back, the podcasts that we made weren't really true podcasts. They were full-on professional produced videos that were edited, and music and all kinds of stuff that were put to them. They just happened to be 5 minute, long episodes, and not really true podcasts, I guess.
You couldn't find them on iTunes, for example.
Probably not. No.
Okay.
No.
Okay. During this podcast project, any interesting stories? You mentioned correlation. Anything that you think our listeners would be interested in? You don't feel forced to talk about it if there's nothing there that you think is interesting.
I think there was a few interesting things. First of all, what I found was that there were so many layers of involvement in producing a video that I'm the project manager and I'm writing the Gantt charts for these things, and it's just copy and pasting from previously done templates, but they're very standardized in the process that you're supposed to go through. And so I'm looking at all this stuff. First of all, I've got to go get bids. The family history department or whatever the sponsor is comes to me or the project manager and says, we would like to do a project around this. And they kind of scope it out and they define what it is and what it's going to be. And then it's my job now to go out and get estimates for what is it going to cost for you to do this. And so the problem is I have no clue because there's so many layers. You've got to get the writers that are going to write the scripts. You've got to get the designers that are going to design the logos and the graphics and the stuff that's coming in and out on the videos and the fading and whatever graphics are involved that they have to do stuff to. You've got the actors that you've got to figure out who's going to be your actors and have the casting calls and do all that stuff. And anyway, the layers go on and on all the way through correlation and what they have to be involved in, and the billing hours for their time, and editors to edit your script and the billing hours for their time. And every department has a specific per hour bill, I guess you will, that they assign to their work, so that when I say, here's a general script, it's going to be 5 minutes long, blah, 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 and I give them all the information, then they come back with an estimate. And so then what I do at that point is I compile all the estimates together and I write a formal project plan, and then I submit it back to the sponsor and I say, to do these 24 episodes, it's going to cost you $250,000 or whatever the case is. And then they have to decide, okay, well, out of my entire portfolio budget, how much do I really want to spend, or do I want to allocate $250,000 to that project? Because what are the opportunity costs, right? What am I missing out on if I do that on other projects that now I can no longer do? But even outside of that, there's still more planning that goes into it, because you have to have a general outline and general budget of all of the projects your department is going to do in September of the year before. And that has to be submitted to the disposition of ties department, and they got to review it so that when January 1 comes, I know that my department is going to do 72 projects this year, and this is how much money we have to do it. And then if you will go over budget on one project, well, I'm under budget on this one, so now I'm going to do a transfer of funds from this project, and they actually would put quote unquote money, which I'll talk about in a minute, in one project bucket and move it over. I would do a request to have the finance department actually transfer money into project number 28756 or whatever it was, and then I would have more money if I was over budget, so on and so forth. Or they would just say, we're done, we don't want to put any more money into it.
So I have a couple reactions to just hearing you describe it. One, that sort of sounds like how a corporation would probably, lots of corporations would handle projects. And the second reaction is, it sounds like they tried to be really thoughtful and careful and deliberate about how things got done. So was there anything, positive or negative about that for you, or was that just kind of what you expected and it was sort of all positive?
Yeah, well, so I'll just say right out of the gate, the positive side of that for me was, you know what, I'm working for an organization that does true project management, that I have to scope this, I have to schedule this, and I have to budget it, and I have to make sure that all of those things are delivered on time. And that's what real project management was. And that was exciting to me, because I was in a true project management with a true project management office that I had to submit change requests to. If I wanted to do an additional podcast outside of the 20 that I had scoped, I had to rewrite a change request and get new bids and submit it into the project management office and get formal approval. And the managing director had to sign off. And I mean, it was a real deal in terms of project management.
And it sounds like, that you could interpret that as reflecting really well on the church, that they wanted to do things right. They wanted to do things well and thoughtfully.
Yep.
Is that kind of how you felt?
I did. I felt 100%. I felt, yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that I noticed is, and it was said quite frequently, that in the past, it used to be, well, you're not really going to get paid a lot. You're going to really more work for the blessings of working for the church and what comes with that. And the church will take care of you and you'll do well, but from what I saw when I was there, and I don't know necessarily what other people made, but I felt like they compensated me fairly well. It really felt like they wanted. And I think the big thing was, in this day and age of media, the adversary is using media as a mechanism to keep people away. And so we as the church need to combat that with equally as good technology and media productions. And so they would try to hire the best of the best, and so I think people right out of college, especially that were really good and promising, they would really try to go after those guys, and they would keep them. I think a lot of them for kind of like me for 2 or 3 or 4 years. But at some point, there is a point where they can't pay you what the private sector would. And, when I left, they asked me specifically, well, what do we need to do to get you to stay? And I said, well, here's my offer. You can match that offer. And they said, yeah, there's no way that's going to happen. And, so they do lose people to that. But all in all, I think they're fair in their compensation.
And I had someone ask what your impressions were of the caliber of employee at church headquarters. What would you say to that?
So 2 things on that. A couple things. First, I remember first going to work for the church and riding the train into town because they, as part of your deal, you get the UTA bus passes and train passes, and all that is just part of your package. So it didn't cost anything, and you can go right up to the corporate office front door, and you don't have to drive every day. So I remember sitting on the train and just kind of looking down at all of the other people that are going to work for the church. And you can tell pretty much, who most of those people are because you start to see them over and over again. And I just remember being new there and looking at them and just seeing them kind of spaced off in this dazed look and, observing that these guys have kind of become zombies. They're in zombie mode. They're just complacent. They just do their thing. They're not really trying to go anywhere, advance in their career. They're not super motivated. They're not driven. They just seem like they're resigned to this is what it is and it's what it's always going to be. And they just get into their comfort mode or zombie mode is what I called it, and I kind of right even from the beginning felt like I never want to do that. I want to have the drive and the passion and the motivation and whatnot to be better, to advance in my career, to, do other things. And so in that respect, I felt like there was a little bit of complacency. The other respect with that is that some of the newer people that would come in, younger, I don't know, but or maybe just newer people to the church, I really felt like they were highly motivated and highly driven and highly skilled, very talented people, could do some amazing stuff with media production, film, video, and graphic design and all those different things. That they had some super good people. And then, like I said, I felt like there was people there that had been, and not all of them definitely were this way, but there were people who had been there 20 plus years, and they were those zombie people that, you couldn't go to them and say, hey, I've got this deadline and I have to give this whatever to the project sponsor by Thursday. They didn't care. A lot of times it's like, well, if I get to it, I get to it. And and the other thing with that is it seemed like the priesthood department and the missionary department trumped no matter what it was, what they wanted and what they needed, always bumped everybody else to the back of the line. And so that was a little bit a part of it where we're jockeying for the same resources, but certain departments have a bigger stick and their stuff's always going to get done first.
So what and I don't know if you want to give one of the earbuds to AnnaMarie, but tell us what that department does. You said priesthood department?
Which department?
The one that you said bumps everybody else out.
Priesthood.
Yeah, so the priesthood department is another media portfolio. And so anything for the manuals that you use in gospel doctrine, to your elders' quorum, to anything priesthood related, or I guess general church related, really, any of their media projects, manuals or whatever for editing and correlation to do, would always trump. And even in translation, Seminary and Institutes would translate into 32 languages, and trying to get their stuff done in even Spanish a lot of times. And I remember one particular instance, I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but with Seminary and Institute, we were trying to get a student manual in English edited. And the a student manual I'm trying to remember what the experience was. No, it was posting online in digital format. We were trying to get an English student manual posted online, and we were putting it into the pool. Well, priesthood department uses the same resources to put material online. Missionary department uses the exact same resources to do theirs. We submit ours in, and then they send out a spreadsheet of the priority of what everything is. And this student manual in English to get posted online and in the gospel library for students to download on their mobile app, right, was prioritized below the Chinese primary songbook to be posted online. And it's like, why would you make those types of priorities? And it didn't seem like it mattered to the people that were doing it. Whatever it was, in fact, one of the guys that worked for Seminary and I always had the standing joke that priesthood will decide, because that was whatever they wanted is pretty much what happened. Or, it was always priesthood will decide or correlation will decide. That was kind of our standing joke, was that they'll decide. So go ahead.
Why don't you, if you can remember, tell us the main major departments at church headquarters that you can remember, just to give us a lay of the land of how it's all structured.
Yeah, so you've got the priesthood department, you've got the church history, family history department, you have the missionary department.
Oh, wait, go slowly. Start over.
Okay, so you've got the priesthood.
Priesthood, which is about priesthood manuals and anything related to the priesthood.
Yeah. Well, and not even that, but I mean, even like the Relief Society manuals were probably part of priesthood as well.
Okay. So kind of that third hour stuff, third hour of church. Okay. Priesthood. Okay. Priesthood. Who else? What other departments?
Conference, I think, fell under the priesthood.
I thought that was church history.
No. No, okay, conference, so I think, was under priesthood.
General conference?
That fell under the priesthood purview of, Okay. So you had priesthood department, and then they combined church history and family history under one media portfolio.
Okay.
For a group to manage. So there was a manager of the church history, family history portfolio. Okay. If that makes sense. They would each have their separate budgets, but because they were small enough, they would combine those two under one program manager to manage all the stuff for both of them independently. But they each had their separate budgets.
So church history and family history.
Yep.
Church history is it used to be Marlon Jensen, now it would be Snow. I think we kind of have a sense for what they do. And then family history would be helping out with genealogy and stuff.
Yeah, family search was really big, and media to, get people excited about doing family history and all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
What they did. And the family history library was a big part of that. When I left working for the church history, family history portfolio, it was right at the time that they were initiating the project to redo the family history library.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen that or no, but I was right there as they were initiating those projects to do that. And it was a multi-year project to get that done and do that.
Very cool.
And they do Roots Tech as well. That's part of the family history portfolio, and that's a huge event that falls under that too. And then just general media that they put out. They have budgets for, all the family history, other little things that they want to do.
Okay. All right. What other departments?
So CES was one, and that was broken up a little bit because CES also had money that was put into that department from BYU for projects that they wanted done, and so they would put in a certain portion. They'd say, we want PSD project publishing services department to manage those projects and do them for us, and we'll contribute money out of BYU into the CES portfolio. And so I didn't manage that portion of it. There was another project manager that did that kind of stuff, and I was slowly starting to get some of that stuff, but by the time when I left, I still hadn't completely taken that over. So CES in general is one, but it breaks it out into the church schools that they had, BYU, Idaho, the overseas ones, all those that they had for church schools. That was really more of what we called CES as church schools. And so my side of it was Seminary and Institutes was the other one. And then they had the magazines, I think was the other one for all the publications for the Liahona and the
That's
Ensign.
under CES?
No, that's a separate one. Is the publications, or I don't know what they call it, magazines probably.
Okay.
And that was another one. There may have been a couple others there. There was actually an internal one for the PSD department itself. There was a media budget for publishing services department as well for our HR type stuff and all that. It was a smaller one, and then there was IC. I'm not sure how ICS worked with that, but there was some media stuff involved with ICS.
Okay, other major departments. So ICS.
What's
Yeah.
ICS?
But ICS was, they're more separate. There was some media stuff for them for the online content, for publishing in the gospel library and doing some of those things. And they used ICS budget or ICS resources, but I still think actually now that I think of it, they fell under the priesthood department.
Okay.
LDS.org had, some budget stuff specifically allocated to that, but I think that they fell under the priesthood department.
So how about the technology group? Just the people in charge of technology. What was that group?
That's the ICS side
ICS.
that we would, yeah.
What does ICS stand for?
I don't know. I can't
Okay,
remember. You
probably computer systems, internal computer systems.
Yeah, information computer systems. Or something. Yeah, probably.
And then isn't there like construction, like church buildings and temples kind of thing? Isn't that a major department?
Yep. Yeah, actually temples I think is one.
Temples and construction. Okay, so that gives us a sense.
But in terms of media, there wasn't a lot. I mean, that's another major department. But in terms of pure media, they weren't involved in the overall media budget, right? So they have a managing director of publishing services department, and temple construction and design and all that stuff wouldn't fall under their purview. We would all, as independent departments that I just mentioned, would all submit our individual budgets into the managing director, and then he would submit those budgets to the disposition of tithes to look overall budget.
So your group was which one again?
So when I started out working there, I was church history, family history.
Okay.
For about the first year, and then I moved over to Seminary and Institutes was the one that I pretty much fully ran in that, guys. I reported to a manager that was still over Seminary and Institutes and CES. So there was my counterpart that worked more of the church schools side of the CES stuff, and then I worked the Seminary and Institutes, and we both reported up to a manager there that person reported to the managing director.
Got it. Okay, so you did this podcast. What came next?
I think the interesting thing in this, when I started in this podcast, was nobody knew anything. I mean, we had all worked there for various times. Some had been there several years, some hadn't. And the process for producing was still new. So we knew that we had to create the script for it going forward, and we knew the general process, or at least they did. And I was just kind of following along because I was so new and getting the budgets that they requested and just kind of flying by the seat of my pants and, trying to figure it out as I went. It was kind of a sink or swim type. There wasn't really a lot of training. But the thing that stuck out to me that I didn't know, we had gone several podcasts, probably 8 or 10 podcasts in, where we had written the scripts. And so I sat down on a weekly meeting with a script writer that worked for Publishing Services Department, and then counterparts that actually worked for for family history. And there was a couple of designers or producers, I guess is what they called them, that worked for family history. So the producers would come up with the ideas for the project of what they wanted to do, and then they would bring their ideas to me because they were not allowed to produce their own media, even though they did. A lot of them did. The church was really trying to pull all media production into the publishing service department and not let each individual department go rogue like they used to, because family history department would go buy a bunch of cameras and equipment, and then church history would go buy a bunch, and priesthood would go buy, and they're rebuying all this stuff, and there's so much waste in all the stuff that was being purchased there that they decided, we're not going to allow you guys to do that anymore. If you want any media produced, you have to go through your project manager, program manager, through the publishing service department, and they'll control all of that. And that way you could share resources across all departments instead of rebuying all the same equipment for each individual department, if that makes sense. So, so it all got consolidated into the publishing service department, and so we're writing these scripts, and we have the producer that initiated the project from the family history side. We have me and the script writers, and we bring in some food, and we throw up the Word doc on the projector, and we're going through, and we're talking about who the characters should be and what they should be like. This one should be funny, and this one should be serious, or we can't be too funny because then the correlation department will think it's irreverent, and so you have to kind of walk the line of trying to be cool and hip and new, but not too cool and not too hip, because then you stand out, and they don't want that kind of messaging going out. And so anyway, we get 8 or 10 podcasts in where we've written the scripts and we've shot the videos for them. And now we're going to get final correlation approval. And after that, send them out for translation, because we were going to translate into a bunch of languages and post them out. So the first thing that stuck out to me is the correlation department comes back and they're like, did you guys get these scripts approved? And we're like, what do you mean? You're not allowed to shoot any film or video on any scripts that you've done until you have correlation approve of your edit your scripts and approve of your scripts. And I didn't know that. I was new, and apparently none of the other people knew that either. And so we had a little bit of a hiccup there where we had to go reshoot some stuff in the final IP, the intellectual property and correlation approval, where we didn't have some of the stuff that they wanted, and we had to cut some scenes and reshoot some scenes and do things differently. And so then we learned, okay, once we write these scripts, we have to have correlation approve of them. And then after that, when we sent them, so we did that, but then in subsequent podcasts, when we sent them out to translation, we then found out, no, you have to have the translation department approve of your scripts too, because some of the things that you do or say or humor that you put in there in other languages, either it's not going to translate and it's not going to be funny, or it's going to be offensive if you translate it word for word. And so you got to have the translation from each of the departments sign off on that too. And I'm like, wow, yeah, no idea of all the layers of red tape just to go through to get a video produced. And so really big learning curve there. But one of the instances I do remember was when we sent it to correlation for approval on a scene that we were green screening at the motion picture studio. They have this huge room that's 2-3 stories tall with this gigantic green screen. Actually, they have 2 of them kind of side by side. Well, we were in one of the bays there, and we were green screening a trip to Hawaii, where somebody was going to learn about their ancestors in Hawaii and do something there. And we had green screened in the sand and the beach, and we had some beach balls out there, and people can buy on skateboards, and we were all wearing Hawaiian shirts and stuff. And correlation department said you can't put that in there, because when you put this out on the internet and in other languages, people in third world countries see that the Americans here are living these lavish lifestyles at the church office building or on this continent, and it's very offensive to them that they're paying their tithing dollars, and the green screening that you've done so real, like you're actually taking these trips to Hawaii and whatnot, and it's not something that's appropriate for these third world countries, because they'll assume that we're wasting their tithing money or whatnot.
So when you work with correlation, is there a whole staff? Do you just work with low-level people? Is there just one guy that is correlation? Like, what do you know about the actual correlation department?
So I know that through the project management software, when it came time to submit to correlation, they have the software and whatnot that just really automates all of that. And it will go to the correlation department in an automated way. I'll get it ready to submit and take it to the correlation department and basically drop it off at the front desk. If I have the final media, like the DVDs, I would have to print off 5 DVDs, for example, with these 8 podcasts that we do. So we do them in sections. Let's say we do 8 podcasts. I have 5 DVDs that I produce, or 10, I don't remember the number, but there was several DVDs that I would drop off to the correlation department at the front desk, and list the project number, fill out the paperwork with it to attach to it. And then I don't know where it would go from there.
Okay, so you didn't directly interact with the people.
Nope. I would drop it off at the front desk, and they would go through and do the correlation side. Now, we had a person who would work for my department that did intellectual property, and their job was to take the final DVD and slow motion go through everything in there. And if there's anything in there, you can see the word Dell on a laptop, they would notate it, and you'd have to go and black it out, or anything that's proprietary or could be construed as proprietary in any way would have to be blacked out, or in some cases reshot. They would go through everything and look at the forms for releases. If there's anybody that's considered a part of it or too close, or they're not part of a general audience, they would have to have release forms. And if we didn't have release forms, we'd have to go try to track them down. And if we couldn't track them down, we couldn't use that section, or we'd have to gray them out. We couldn't find them. And so we'd have to blur the background on the videos. And so the IP department, I knew who that was. And that was all intellectual property. But when it also went out for correlation approval, I would just get the feedback back of, this is what needs to change and this is what you need to do.
How did the feedback come? In what electronic format or written format?
Yeah, it would come in email format, or forms would be filled out. And usually they wouldn't come back to me. They would go back to the family history department. Like when you're writing the scripts, because the family history department is in charge of that, the approval stuff would go back to the people who wrote the scripts or were in charge, the producer who was in charge of the script. And then they would have to go, okay, correlation doesn't like this. They want us to change that. And so then in our next week's meeting, we'd go through and change whatever needed to be changed.
So it was kind of like this black box where you would submit the content and then receive the feedback back.
Yep. And I'm assuming when we would deliver the final product and we had to have a certain number of them, that there was more than one person looking at it to make sure that it's correct. They didn't just have one person do it. If I'm giving them 5 DVDs, right, they're having probably 5 different people look at it and provide their feedback, and then compiling it all together and then sending it back.
And as you were working with correlation, did you feel like, oh yeah, this makes perfect sense, I'm glad there's correlation? Or did you feel, whoa, this is kind of weird? How did it feel for you just to know that there was a correlation department and to have to work with them?
At that point, when we were writing scripts for a podcast and whatnot, I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, there was some of them where stuff that I would have never thought about, but we had a character that was a female who was teaching a newbie how to do family history. And we shot a part where we did kind of like a spoof on Mystery Science Theater 3000, and we had them sitting together in a movie theater, and you could see the silhouettes from behind, kind of like my wife and I here behind, and then they were showing on the actual movie screen a deal about this guy's family history and blah, 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 do a movie, and they were making comments, throughout, oh, so you can do this, and I can find, and whatever. Well, at the beginning of it, when they were walking into the movie theater, they were holding popcorn, and the girl had a wedding ring on, and they obviously weren't married. She was just somebody who was helping him, and they went into the movie theater together, and because they were there together and she had a wedding ring on, they made us nix that part because it was inappropriate to have a married woman going to a movie theater with another man.
They weren't married in the movie?
Yeah, they weren't married in the movie.
Okay,
She was
okay.
just a woman helping a man learn, a guy learn to do family history, but they weren't married in real life. And well, they're in a theater, so correlation said no.
That's interesting. Okay.
So, I mean, they looked at all kinds of, which makes sense, right? Because we never thought of that. I mean, you wouldn't have thought of that at all. So I think what we just ended up doing was blurring out her wedding ring or cutting the scene that showed her wedding ring or whatnot. So we didn't have to reshoot the whole episode, but
That's funny.
yeah,
Okay,
just some crazy stuff like that.
so for you, it made sense to have a correlation committee that worked well for you.
Yeah, at the time, yeah, I understood that, oh, yeah, this is the type of stuff they do. And they don't want people going rogue out there and, oh, I want to make this really cool video or whatnot and have it misrepresent or not represent the church in some way, that the church kind of has a standard message that
Yeah.
they want to give to everybody. And,
Yeah.
and in that instance, it makes sense that they got to make sure to protect their quote unquote brand.
Okay, so what came after the podcast?
So that was really kind of my major project on that, on the family history side. Did a little bit of work on revising some church history manuals and things like that. But for the most part, that was probably my biggest one there. And it was shortly thereafter, actually, as that one was winding down, that I was transferred over to work for the Seminary and Institute department.
Now, did you work on the church history manuals that are coming out now, the ones that are informed by the essays and that are trying to, okay, so you weren't a part of any of that. All right.
Nope.
So you moved over to CES?
Yep, I went over to that side. Really hit it off well there with the producers. So in most of the instances on the Seminary and Institute side, they bring in people into the church office building that were in the field as seminary teachers or institute directors or whatever different levels who have made a career out of being an institute director or being a seminary teacher or whatever the case is of various different levels throughout that organization. And they put out to those seminary teachers a job posting saying, we need a digital media producer, or we need a writer, or we need internal training materials producer, somebody that can manage all that stuff. So they have multiple actual seminary teachers that get a promotion to come and work at the church office building and come up with ideas for new media production to, for the kids and whatnot. And those are the people that I would work with as kind of my counterparts. So those people were the ones who thought of the project, initiated the project, came up with the ideas, and then they would submit those ideas on a yearly basis into the overall portfolio of all seminary and institute projects that we would do for the next year. And so they used to also make their own videos and whatnot, and the church put the nix on that and said, nope, you got to do everything through the publishing services department. And so they would come to me to initiate a new project. And sometimes it wasn't something that they thought of in the year before, but they're like, you know what, we really need this. Do we have any leftover budget money anywhere, or can you move money from another project over? And I would have to look through and, I can take 3,000 here and I can take 5,000 and I can take 12 and whatever. And now we can initiate a new project. And
Right.
Yeah, I had the latitude to do that for them. But for the most part, we really tried to stick to what we had planned for that budget.
Okay. In your outline, you have a few sections, one called Working at the Church, one called Meeting General Authorities, and then there's the reorganization one. Let's jump back to that. Why don't you paint a picture for us about just sort of some of the main interesting things about working for the church, just generally?
So I think when I first started working there, it was really foreign to me to go in and sit down with a group of, let's say, 4 to 6 people in a conference room and begin every meeting with a prayer. You're in the workforce, but every meeting was with a prayer. And what I used to do with my meetings is I would really try to have, because I worked at the motion picture studio in Provo, I didn't want to go down for a 1-hour meeting and have to dress up at the church office building for that 1-hour meeting and then work either the rest of the day there or turn around and drive back to the motion picture studio. So I would try to have 1 or 2 days a week that were my meeting days. And I would go and I would meet with everybody. And then when I switched over to Seminary and Institutes, I ended up working there full time, but I still at the church office building full time. and left working down at the motion picture studio. But I would do the same thing and have my meeting days be one day. So it was back to back to back to back to back, half hour or hour long meetings on one day, and just to get them all done. But the problem with that or the thing that was really weird to me about that, is you start your first meeting with a prayer and you have 4 or 6 people there. That half hour or hour meeting ends. 2 people might get up and walk out, and all the rest of the people stay there. And then one person comes in, and now we have another prayer. And I was always like, guys, can't we just do one blanket prayer for the whole deal here? Why do we have to have a different meeting? I mean, don't you think God probably knows that we're here, and let's just bless this day that, the Spirit will be with us. But it was a repetitive prayer every time. Whoever said it was the same thing: guide us to produce the media that will touch the hearts, and kind of all the same thing regurgitated over and over.
I remember someone saying, "Can't we just buy all the groceries, bless all the groceries at once, and then
There you go. That's efficient.
Yeah, seriously." And
Okay, so you got the prayers were a little bit weird to you. The frequency.
Yeah, I mean, the frequency of them. I really wasn't used to. Gosh, it just seems like we're bugging God a lot. Doesn't he have some worlds to create, or some other more important things than to check in with, kind of what we're doing down here every hour?
Okay, what else was interesting about working at the church? You got temple recommends. Temple recommends.
Yeah. Everybody that works for the church, and I believe it's even in their for-profit arms, if you're a janitor, you have to be a current temple recommend holder, or if you haven't gone through the temple, have an equal, note from your bishop or whatnot from your bishop. And they checked once a year. You had to go show your current temple recommend. So they were very, very strict about that. The belief was, if everybody there holds a temple recommend, then you're all on the same page in terms of why you're there.
And briefly, what does that do for you to know that your employment is tied to having a temple recommend? What's psychologically, was that good? Was that hard?
It was a little bit frustrating for me. I think, just for the sheer fact that I guess I had always been a little bit desirous to pay tithing as regularly as you should, and it just always seemed like such a sacrifice to me to pay tithing. And it's like I got to be a full tithe payer here, and I got to make sure that I'm on this, and while they compensate me well, maybe before the church, coming to work for the church, I wasn't a full tithe payer, and so now I got to make sure that I am, and there's a 10% cut out of the top that I wasn't planning on when I made that move, that now I got to do. And but I understood, all in all, that they don't want people who, aren't of the kind of the top tier and focused on their spirituality and whatnot together. So it didn't really bother me, I guess, that bad. It was just kind of seemed like a little bit controlling, but other than that, it wasn't that bad.
Okay. Any other parts about the culture of working at the church before we talk about the general authority stuff?
I will say, hugely family oriented. I remember actually having anxiety attacks over my cell phone not ringing or not getting emails. I came from a mortgage industry where if somebody called me, which they did at 2 a.m, and they needed help with the software, that I was up at my computer, remoting into the network and trying to help them resolve their issues 24/7. That was my responsibility, to go into work at the motion picture studio, and 4:30 rolls around, and I'm sitting there doing my work and typing on the computer, and I look up and I look around, and all the lights are off in the house, and I'm the only one there, and everybody else has gone home. And I'm asking, what the heck, where'd you guys go yesterday? And what do you mean? Well, I was here at 4:30. It's like, yeah, we go home. We got families, we go do our family thing. And so when the work was done, it was done, and you left the work at the table. And I had my phone that the company, the church paid for, that was my cell phone. And I would just get anxiety because I'm so used to 6 o'clock and 7 o'clock and 8 o'clock emails coming in and answering. And I'm like, oh man, something must be wrong or something must be down. And it was really a hard change for me to just say, 4:30, the work is done, time to go home.
That's kind of cool, right? I mean,
yeah.
And AnnaMarie is nodding.
Yeah, I loved that part. I felt like in his career before that, then I would get calls. I mean, on my 30th birthday, he called and said he wasn't coming home until the middle of the night because they had a client that needed something, um, and he was on a road trip. What was supposed to be a 2-day trip, and pretty soon I'm shipping him clothes because he's going to be on the road for 3 weeks, and it's hard to raise young kids and not know when your husband's going to be there and not be there, and have him be under a lot of stress. And so I actually really enjoyed that. And when he came home, he was not stressed out. He enjoyed the kind of the environment. It was really low stress, and there wasn't a lot of pressure. And when he hopped on that bus to head home, he was done, and he got to be fully with the family. So I felt like it was a really, really positive working environment.
Yeah. And the way that I worked it too was that I would get to the bus and catch the right around 8 a.m. train, or excuse me, the train station, catch the 8 a.m. train. And I would answer all my emails. I had my laptop with me, and so I would answer all my emails, and I would use that, commute as part of my workday. So I didn't have to be at the church office building right at 8 o'clock. I would utilize that time to answer emails and do work and create schedules and whatever I needed to do during the train ride, so I could go in and show up to the church office building or sometime around 9 o'clock or so. And then I would leave, around 4 o'clock, and then I would spend the rest of that time on the ride home doing the additional work. So it was nice, and it kind of gave you a break to get out of I'm at the office, and I had some commute time to, do my thing and transition out of work, and now I'm into family mode.
Okay. So good work-life balance and good support for families.
Yep.
That's
yeah,
great.
I loved it.
That's great. Okay, so you talk about how general authorities are treated. Talk about how general authorities are treated at the church office building.
You're worried that you're going to step into an elevator, so one of the rules that they had there is if you ever leave the floor that you're assigned to work on, you have to wear your suit coat. So if I worked on the 27th floor, so if I wanted to go to the 26th floor and I was just going to take the stairs, it didn't matter. I had to put my suit coat on. But the fear was, you're going to jump in an elevator and one of the general authorities is going to jump in there with you and you're not going to have your suit coat on. And they wanted everybody, I think, if you're out in public, because the church office building has other visitors and whatnot coming, and they wanted everybody to look the same and kind of standardize that too. But
I just have to tell you that I used to work for Arthur Anderson in Chicago, which was one of the world's largest accounting firms. It was the world's largest accounting firm in the 80s and 90s, and that was the rule there. So I wonder if they got that from like IBM or Arthur Anderson or something like that, sort of a corporate holdover from formal IBM accounting corporate culture.
Yeah, it could be. And I always thought it was weird because I would go to whatever floor, I think the 8th floor is where the Seminary and Institute people were, and they'd come in and none of them, or not none, but some of them aren't wearing their suit jackets, and then there I am with mine. And then I would take my jacket off when I'm in the conference, and then I'd put it back on when I leave, and then vice versa. When they'd come up to my floor, I wouldn't be wearing the suit jacket, and they'd be wearing it. And it's like, I don't know, it just seems a little bit weird. Like, does that really matter?
Right. Okay. So what else? General authorities.
So there was a couple of devotionals. I didn't really spend a lot of time kind of rubbing shoulders with the general authorities. I did get the chance to spend a little bit of time, 30 minutes to an hour maybe, with Elder Oaks when he was doing a panel discussion for Seminary and Institute. And, he comes in, they do their little opening deal with the directors of the Seminary and Institutes, and they have their opening prayer and all that stuff. And then he comes into the room where they have all the craft services, laid out there for the food and all the things for him to eat, and, all of the staff, I guess, to eat, and just kind of being there, hanging out with him and getting the chance to talk, really down to earth. I was always worried, and it was always struck me, like even when I was in the MTC and one of the apostles or prophet or somebody would come and speak in the MTC, people would be all, I got to go shake his hand. And, I really felt the Spirit in his presence and whatnot. I never felt that in the MTC, when I'm shaking the prophet's hand, I just felt like, this is a dude. This is just a guy. I didn't really have any special, powerful experiences. And when I chatted with Elder Oaks, he just seemed like a typical stake president type of guy. He was kind of quiet and just very personable and social, and had some fun stories to tell, but you could still tell he had the serious side, and there was an air of authority about him that was a little bit intimidating as well, and I was definitely nervous. But yeah, I didn't really have any super powerful spiritual experiences. He just talked about his home life and, a couple of just small talk type things.
So you've got some bullets in your outline about meeting GAs. Do you want to cover those really quick?
Yeah, so the one thing about meeting them, and I guess I don't know if meeting them is the right term, but more of interacting with them in situations, it seemed like when their input was needed on big projects, or when they were involved in them and giving their input on projects, that half or more, 3/4 of the people in the room would look at that and they would know from their being in the trenches, right, and having the experiences, they would know, yeah, that idea is not a good idea and it's probably not going to work. But nobody dared say that, right? I mean, it was all nod your head and, yeah, that sounds like a great idea, and everybody was really scared to give true feedback. And that was, I'm not like that. If he would have asked my opinion, I would have said, that's a horrible idea, but for the other people, for the most part, would just, yeah, that sounds great. And so I often wondered, how in tune with the reality of situations are they? Because they're not in the trenches day to day, even on media stuff, but outside of media, just in general life and in social media and all these things, they have people that do all that stuff for them and provide them the feedback. And are they getting the true picture, or are they getting the all is well in Zion type, feedback? And do they really have, I don't know, are they really down to earth and in touch with the reality of the situation and what people are going through in the day-to-day church life?
Okay. You have a story about Elder Holland that you mentioned in your outline.
Yeah, so one of the things where people were scared, so we were doing the CES devotional for him at the what's it called, the BYU Conference Center. And we had it pretty much all booked out and all scheduled, and the things that we had to pay for in advance were all paid for and reserved, and non-refundable fees and whatnot that were paid to the BYU Conference Center in order to utilize it for the CES devotional. Well, it turned out that there was a little bit of a conflict, and Elder Holland was also getting a building dedicated to his name. I don't even remember what building it was, but there was something about him getting a building dedicated to his name that he needed to be there for that in St. George. And he had family flying into town for all that, and and it was, for him, it was kind of a big hassle to have to be able to do that. So he proposed that rather than having the production at the BYU Conference Center, to move it to Dixie College.
I found this.
Sorry. To move it to Dixie College and do it there. And so he presented that to the people in Seminary and Institutes, and we said okay. And so we reached out to Dixie College and scheduled all the building or got the bids basically for what's it going to cost to rent your facility, to get the lighting people. When you hire the lighting company, they want their crew to come and work and do all the setup and all the breakdown. You have to now take your production buses, and we had a couple of them that would drive big, huge buses with all the broadcast and everything stuff right there in those buses. RV, like giant RV things, would have to go down to Dixie, and the travel costs and the overnight expenses and all the stuff that goes with that. Dixie College charges you. They have to be the ones to set up the auditorium and tear it down, and the cleanup and the catering and all the stuff that goes with it. So we went through and we got the bids for what that's going to cost us, kind of bottom line, with what we're going to lose that we put down on the BYU Conference Center, and then added the loss on that with what we were now going to have to pay. And BYU Conference Center gives you pretty good discounts, obviously, for the stuff you do there. Dixie didn't give you as many discounts and whatnot. So the net cost of all that was basically $50,000 that was not planned for that one project. I mean, we normally only spend, 30 to 40,000 as it was. So with all the, and it's a lot cheaper because you're doing it locally, but anytime you take it out of town, the costs go up significantly. And so the net bottom line was it cost us $50,000 more than what we had budgeted for that project. Well, I remember talking to the one guy as we got those final numbers, and it's like, what do we do? Should we tell Elder Holland? And I'm like, you know what? Elder Holland is a good guy. He is a guy capable of making decisions, but he can't make decisions if he doesn't have all the information. So all you can do is say, Elder Holland, here's the budget. You asked to move it. I just want you to be aware this is what it's going to cost. Are you okay with this? And I said, that's all you have to do. And, kind of scared. Well, it turned out that nobody gave him the information. And so he wasn't able to make an informed decision. Now, I don't know what his decision would have been. I have no clue. But, it just seemed like there was some waste there. And maybe given the right information, and if people weren't so afraid, to approach these guys, I mean, they're just guys trying to make decisions the best they can with the information they're given. So there's a lot of waste in areas like that. And I sat there and thought, $50,000 of somebody's tithing money is going out the window. Would Elder Holland be mad about that? Would he not? I don't know, but that sure seemed like a lot to me.
So, but at the same time, I remember working at church headquarters, and there was always this sort of prevailing sentiment that you want to consider the tithing funds as really sacred. And there was this saying about the widow's mite.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be accurate to say there was a culture of excess and irresponsibility, right?
Mm-hmm. No, it was constantly, brought up. I think I heard that on a daily basis about, we talk about, we need a new hard drive to store media material on for this project because we ran out of hard drive space. And is that really taking care of the widow's mite? Can we repurpose a hard drive from an old project? Or, so I think in general, people were really trying to do their best. But then in the same token, because budgets were so loosely monitored that if somebody said, you know what, we're going to produce a new EPUB or a new iBook, and we got to make sure that this iBook is compatible with the latest iPads coming out, because the last thing you want to do is, get it for the iPad 3, and now the iPad 4 comes out and the layout doesn't work and blah, blah, blah. And so, you'd go out and buy brand new iPads. Well, where would all the iPad 3s go? And I'm not saying it, there was theft or whatnot, but it seemed like there was a lot of opportunities that you could just charge hardware and other items onto project budgets. And then when the project is over, what happened to some of that stuff? Where did it go? And so it just seemed like it was not very tightly monitored.
Right. Okay. You talk about some changes Bednar made regarding media production. Talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, so originally it was called the Media Services Department, and we had a big departmental meeting where several hundred people went into the church office building on the first floor. They have kind of a conference room there, and it was recorded. They had somebody there recording, and then they had some media people back in the production room, and there was a big presentation of slides, and he basically came, stood up in front of everybody and said, we're doing some reorganization to the departments. And a big part of that was, I mentioned before about each department, like family history, buying millions of dollars worth of their own production equipment, and then Seminary and Institutes buying their own production equipment, and the priesthood department buying their own equipment. They didn't want all that excess and that waste, and so they were bringing everything out of that into more of, it's now a requirement for the publishing services department to do all that stuff. And as part of that, they were talking about breaking down some of the red tape and some of the bureaucracy and the multi-levels that you have to go through to get approvals and things like that. But the gist of it was, he showed this video about, it was a very nicely done, professionally produced video about an airplane flying, and they had these guys, supposed workers for the church, in their suits and ties, and they're tearing down the airplane while it's in the air flying, and they're rebuilding the airplane from the ground up while it's in flight. And that's what Elder Bednar was saying, is that we're rebuilding from the ground up, but we're doing it while we're in flight. We're not stopping any media production. We're going to continue to produce as we make these transitions, and it's going to be tough, and it's going to require everybody to be all hands on deck and all bought in. But his one really kind of powerful statement to get everybody bought in and really on board with this, because there were people who we knew, or they knew, weren't going to like the changes that were coming, because it was going to completely change their job description. And so, looking back on it now, his big powerful thing was, we in our current structure, organizational structure, are not able to produce enough media fast enough to spread throughout the world before the second coming. And then there's that silence, and everybody gets goosebumps, and it's like, wow, holy cow, we got to do this. We got to be involved in this change, because according to Elder Bednar, it sounds like the second coming is going to happen, and we got to get the word out to everybody and make sure that, because you hear how the second coming won't happen until every continent, the gospel's been spread to every continent and everybody's had the chance to hear and whatnot. It's like, oh, well, he's saying this is it right now. We're making our last push to get the media out there so that everybody can hear the gospel, and then here comes Christ, so that was how I interpreted it anyway. It was
That's pretty intense.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the names on your paycheck changing at that time.
Yeah, and I honestly don't know what the purpose was for that, other than they were putting different general authorities over Publishing Services Department to kind of monitor a little bit more closely. But when I first started working there, my paycheck came from the Corporation of the President, and then after that, it changed to the Corporation of the Presiding Bishopric. So the presiding bishopric somehow had tie-ins with the media department from that point forward.
Okay, that's interesting. All right, so let's go back to your work with Seminary and Institute. So what were the main things that you started working on there?
So the big thing with Seminary and Institutes was the rewriting of the manuals that were basically produced in the late 70s and early 80s, and were the ones that were still being used today. Seminary manuals in particular were extremely out of date, and I think that people specifically talked about how the New Testament manual was horrible, that really needed to be rewritten and updated and modernized. I think in one of those manuals, they still had a map of the USSR as an example in there. So, I mean, in 2014 or 13, you're using that in your object lessons. It doesn't quite translate to kids that have no idea probably what the USSR even was. So, definitely out of date. And that was one of the big things that they really wanted to focus on. Well, so a couple of things on that. When I first kind of took these on, the previous way that manuals were done is that the seminary writers would write the entire manual cover to cover, so front to back, every lesson, and that would take them several months to do. Well, then from there, they would take their finished product and they would submit it into the editing department. The editing department would then take 6 months or however long to go through cover to cover and edit it. And the interesting thing I found about that, which is kind of a sidetrack, is that the editing department really acted on behalf of the correlation department quite a bit. It was their job to go through and make sure that everything was doctrinally correct, that the seminary writers wrote, that they weren't misquoting anything, just fact checking in general, grammar, punctuation, spelling, all that stuff as well. But I remember talking to one of the editors saying, yeah, really the correlation department relies on us to do the bulk of the work in terms of correlating and making sure that it's the message that the church wants to deliver and that everything is doctrinally accurate. And so that's probably for me as close as I ever got to the correlation department, is the people who are actually doing the editing took a lot of the heavy lifting for correlating the manuals.
Okay.
So the problem with the production of the manual is when you write it cover to cover, you submit it into editing cover to cover in one big bulk, then it goes back to the seminary writers to edit, and then they fight back and forth with correlation and whatnot until they get the final product. Then it goes over to graphic design and layout, and they have to put it in their software to lay it out, and they have to find the artwork for it and the examples and the graphs, and they have to build all that stuff, and that takes forever as well. And then from there it has to go over to the translation department, and when you're translating it in 32 languages, then that takes a ton of time, right? So you've got to just write one manual in that format, you've got at least 4 years on one manual. And then you move on to the next manual. Well, you've got 5 manuals that you got to do. So by the time you come around to rewrite the first manual that you started on, it's 20 years later.
Wow.
And so that was their process. That's how they did it. And so when I came in, and they had kind of already started with the idea, and from the previous project manager that was running it, but they started with the idea of breaking it up into chunks and saying, we're going to do 12 chunks, and we're going to write the first chunk, and we're going to send it off to editing, and then we're going to move to the next chunk, and so that you could kind of have an assembly line. So all along the way, you'd have the writers still writing chunk 6, and the designers were now designing chunk 2, and the translators were translating chunk 1, and then it would just go through that whole assembly line. So we were able to actually, and it was a whole change in the organizational structure. And I remember fighting with the editors and fighting with all these people, and people didn't want to do it, and they didn't like it, and it wasn't what they're used to doing. And it was like pulling teeth to get people to, let's try it on this and see if we're successful. But ultimately, we ended up doing it that way, and we were able to take the production of the manuals from a 4-year minimum down to a 1-year maximum, which now allowed them to go through within 5 years and have all of them rewritten. And so then the goal was after that to do a 10% revision each year after that. So what they've done now is they've all been published, and so now they don't have to go back and rewrite. All they have to do is go back to the Book of Mormon one, for example, and look at the stuff that new apostles, new prophets, new conference talks, or whatever that they've given, and remove old stuff and put in the newer stuff that's been said about the various topics or chapters or lessons that they're working on. So now, from here on out, instead of a rewrite in 20 years, it's just every 5 years a 10% revision, 10 to 15% revision.
Excellent. Okay,
so,
well that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I thought that was kind of exciting. It was. I felt like I was really making a difference, and I remember the feeling for myself of these are the manuals that my kids are going to study, and millions and millions of people throughout the next years are going to be reading these and touched by the Spirit and converted in their youth through seminary. And I really felt like I was a part of something with a lot of that. Like, this is a really big deal, and the editors that worked on it felt the exact same way. They were fighting over who gets to do the work on it, and they all wanted it because it was such a high profile project. And the designers were the same way. They were really excited and felt like they were in on it, and it was a big deal to them. So everybody felt like they were just really a part of spreading the word and some really important work.
That's great. Okay, so you helped revolutionize the process. Let's move to the section that you have in your outline about inoculation. I think this is a part that's really going to be interesting to people.
Okay. Yeah. So when we first started doing the rewrite of the manuals, I remember, and it wasn't really something that was necessarily written down and strategically planned and methodically, done in the manuals. It was just a general, okay, we recognize that there's a lot of stuff out there that these kids are being exposed to later in life that's shocking to them. So we're kind of doing them a favor is basically the general deal. And I don't know if favor is the right word, but we're really trying to do the right thing in introducing them to some of this controversial material early on in life, so that when they hear it later in life, it's not going to be like a big slap across the face when a anti-Mormon or a non-Mormon or an investigator drops a bombshell on them and they've never heard any of this stuff. And so there was a plan to do that, but there was no formal, methodical, here's exactly how it's going to go. It was just more of, hey, writers, when you're writing this, please make sure that you're giving some of the inoculation type things on the controversial topics.
Now, Mormons, I mean, Sunstone and Dialogue have been around forever, but the internet started really heating up in the early 2000s, and Mormon Story started in 2005. The Bloggernacle started around 2004, 2005. And then by 2009, 2010, Mormon Expression podcast had come on the scene. And, by 2011, 2012 was when, we were working with Marlon Jensen and really providing the feedback to the church that would lead to the essays. So you were there right as a lot of the heat was really increasing, as you could tell that the church inside was starting to be really worried about the internet. And I'm wondering if you were sheltered from all that.
I had no clue. I didn't even know what Mormon Stories or Mormon Expressions or anything was, because I was one of those where don't go to non-church approved sites. I never did. And, you get that feeling of the adversary when you click on a page that looks like it might say something negative about the church. Oh, the devil, the adversary is here trying to tempt me. And I would immediately click off of that stuff. And so I never had any clue at all.
So even though you struggled with tithing, you still stayed away from, questionable sources.
Yep, absolutely, 100%. Had no clue of any of that. So when these guys are talking about inoculation, I'm assuming at this point, looking back, that, they were probably much more aware of some of the stuff that's out there in the internet, and that there are people going through faith crisis and so on and so forth. But I had no clue. I just thought all was well. I thought, everything's great.
And
we're just trying to help these kids.
And so no one would have talked about all this other stuff.
Mm-mm.
Okay.
No, I didn't have anybody that was, like I say, methodically going through and saying, we have all these people who are experiencing major crisis in their faith because they're coming across this. All it was just simple, we want to make sure our youth get exposure to some of this stuff early that's kind of shocking in church history, so it doesn't destroy their faith and their testimonies and whatnot. But other than that, I didn't really have much clue that anything else was even going on out there.
Okay, great. So you this concept of inoculation was introduced to you, and where did it go from there?
Yeah, so and it was a little bit before that that I had kind of started to have some concerns, because when we moved to Utah, and I'm just going to give a little back history here. We moved to Utah, and while our home was being built, we lived in some condominiums. And while we were living in those condominiums, we were going to the ward we were going to eventually go to. And the stake president came by and visited me, it was our bishop. He's the stake president now, but back then he was our bishop. He came by and he visited us in our condo, and we talked and whatnot. Well, when we moved into our house 6 months later, immediately I was called as the Elders Quorum president. And I remember, man, as the Elders Quorum president, I just want to know everything there is to know. I want to be one of the leaders that just is an inspiration and people can look to for answers and whatnot. And I remember our bishop at the time who called me, or I guess the stake president technically calls, but the bishop told me he, submitted my name to the stake president. Well, the stake president was his brother. And now my old bishop is now the new stake president, and that stake president has gone on a mission. But anyway, the whole deal with that is, as an Elders Quorum president, you kind of know in the future your next step is most likely going to be called into a bishopric or maybe a stake high councilman and callings like that. And then eventually you'll be a bishop, and then eventually, you'll be a stake president and a mission president. And I kind of saw that as, okay, well, this is where I'm going. And when you work for the church, it's like you're fresh meat, oh, this is going to be somebody who can be a leader in our ward, and they work for the church and they'll be great. So I wanted to be what all those expectations were. So I'm like, when our current stake president came and spoke in priesthood to the combined, I just remember him pulling stuff out of, and in the Journal of Discourses it says this, and on the Lectures of Faith it says that, and Book of Commandments this, and I'm like, I don't even know what half of those things that you just quoted are, and never even heard of the sources, and so anyway, I looked up to him during that kind of talk or presentation he gave, and I'm like, that's the kind of guy that I want to be, just to know it all. And so I had started down that path, and I said, I'm going to read the Journal of Discourses cover to cover. I'm going to take as long as it takes, and I am going to finish that, which I did. And then I moved on to, Lectures in Faith and the Book of Commandment type stuff, and the Doctrines of Salvation, and, some of those things Mormon doctrine type things that I felt were kind of key things. And I just absorbed it. But along the way, I started being introduced to all these things like Adam God doctrine, Adam God theory, and the blood atonement, and a lot of these things. I'm like, man, that's some really weird stuff. That's kind of bothersome, but you're all in, and you just kind of put it up on your shelf.
Okay.
And so what ties back to that is now they're talking about inoculation, and I remember one of the guys saying, things like Joseph and the seer stone. And I'm like, what are you talking about, seer stone? He used the Urim and Thummim, and then I'm talking about, Joseph Smith and polygamy and polyandry. And so I'm like, wait, what? I never heard of any of that. And so I was already going through a phase where my intent at the beginning was to totally be the most spiritual, most informed, and know my religion as well as I possibly could. And all of a sudden I start seeing these things that are troubling to me. And now I'm getting introduced to more things that are troubling, and I'm like, man, I really have got to start studying some of this stuff, because I don't know any of this stuff that they're talking about. And as we're in the meetings and whatnot, when they're doing some of these things, I'm looking around to see, is there anybody else that is kind of shocked or questioning, or I couldn't tell, and I'm thinking, man, it must be I'm the only one that doesn't know, And so I figured, man, I really better get out and study some of this stuff. And then that's kind of what took me down the path of research and my ultimate faith crisis.
Okay, so you're digging in deeply to Mormon doctrine and and you're hearing about all these things you'd never heard before as you're trying to rewrite the Seminary and Institute manuals.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, all right. So I see you mentioning they're coming across the Damon Smith podcast. So how did you hear about Mormon Stories or other sort of unapproved sources, and what made you feel comfortable starting to dig into those?
So I had been for roughly a year now kind of trying to research some of these things, and I'd had questions of my own, and I never shared it with anybody, never said a word of it to my wife, to my bishop, to anybody. It was just like, all the answers will eventually come. If I study hard enough and I work hard enough, the answers will come. And even if they don't, I'll know it in the next life. And so I was on a family trip with my extended family to go on a golf trip. And my wife stayed home with the kids, and so I went with my other family members. And one of my family members, it somehow came up where we were talking about the church and some of the issues, just some weird things that I think the both of us had heard. And then it led to, well, have you ever heard of this guy named Tom Phillips who wrote a letter to Elder Holland? And I'm like, no. And he's like, well, yeah, I read this. You ought to check it out. And I'm like, okay, well, let's read it. And we're in the car driving to Mesquite. So together we read the entire letter exchange from Tom Phillips out loud. And then the response from Elder Holland and that whole deal. And I had never heard of it before. And I'm like, holy crap, man, it kind of blew my mind a little bit. Number one, it's like, these are good questions that this guy is asking. Why don't you just answer the questions? I would love to know those answers. And some of those things I never even thought of before. But now that you mention it, yeah, I kind of want to know the answer. So I was a little shocked and a little like, why would you not give the answer? But at the same token, I'm like, okay, maybe there are other people out there that are experiencing these same things that I'm going through and feeling guilty that I'm having all these concerns and worries. Maybe I'm a little bit justified. And so that kind of spurred me a little bit more to go down the path and learn all the stuff that's out there.
Okay.
So I don't know where.
So the Damon Smith podcast?
Oh, Damon Smith. Yeah. So that's what introduced all of that stuff. And then that whole weekend.
So the Tom Phillips thing.
Yeah, that's what kind of started all of it.
Okay.
Is, okay, there's stuff out there. And so then it's like, well, you know what? I better go out here and try to start looking and seeing what's really out here. And then I think I stumbled on Mormon Stories podcasts. And I think there was also the other one with Grant Palmer.
Okay.
So I listened to both of those over that week that I was in Mesquite and my off time from the golfing stuff that we were doing, just powered through as many of the podcasts that I could. So I listened to several of those. The Damon Smith one was one that just kind of floored me. It's like, yeah, I know what he's talking about with correlation and all those things. I've experienced that. And, that kind of lit a fire under me. And I don't know, just the way that he spoke too, just a very intellectual guy, and just listening to him talk, he knew his stuff. And so that one really kind of impressed upon me. And so I ultimately then ended up sharing it with my wife, and we listened to it after that on a drive to Boise. And then here, 6 months ago or so, I listened to it again with my son, my 16-year-old. So I've actually listened to that one 3 times, and that's probably one of my favorites of all, because he really goes into some good stuff on that one.
So the first time you listened to the Damon Smith and the Tom Phillips stuff, about what month and year? Any idea when that would have been?
It was probably like January of 2013.
Okay. All right. So we're in 2013 now.
Yeah.
All right. So you start really doing this research into unapproved sources, and yet you're trying to work at the church.
Yeah.
So what happened?
Yeah. So that weekend we were in Mesquite. I'm looking up stuff, and I find the Mormon Curtain was one of the places. And Mormon Think was another one. And I remember going on there and reading some of these things that some of these guys have really critically thought about this. And one of them that stood out to me was the whole concept of the Jaredite barges and what it would take to actually build a transoceanic vessel with no tools, no nothing in 2200 BC. And to be in that ship for 340 whatever days, singing praises night and day, and the brother of Jared building these things and getting them completely done before he realizes they're completely dark. And after 8 of them have been built, then he goes to the Lord and says, well, hey, what am I going to do about light? Halfway through the first one, you'd realize there was a problem, but the story, was a little bit off. And the thing that really struck me on that one was the brother of Jared speaking about light. He goes to the Lord and says, what are we going to do with light? And he suggests windows. And the Lord comes back and says, no, you can't do windows because they'll be dashed to pieces. And that's, right there in the scripture saying the windows will be dashed to pieces. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, that's 2200 BC that this guy's talking about building windows. They didn't invent blown glass for windows until like 1400 AD. So how are these guys going to the Lord and talking about, no, the windows will be dashed to pieces? There was no concept of a window back then. And so then that was for me when I really started critically thinking about these Book of Mormon stories and what's there. And so that whole weekend was just obsessively, going through that type of stuff. And so that ultimately, like I say, led me to the Mormon Curtain and some of those. And working at the church, it became harder and harder. And it became harder and harder to keep quiet about it too, because I'm also now the Elders Quorum president. And, at that point I had kind of started to talk to my wife a little bit. When I was on my trip to Mesquite, I sent her a copy of the Tom Phillips letter and I said, this kind of concerns me. Read this. And she freaked out a little bit at that point. She was like, oh no, my husband's going into apostasy and this is really bad and, not good at all. And I think
what was that like for you, AnnaMarie?
The second that I got the text from him, I didn't even read it. I know how he is. I know his personality. I know once he gets going on something that it's going to be a long road. And so, good or bad, it's not necessarily a bad thing. But knew it wasn't something that he would just leave alone. And I was pregnant at the time, and it was very kind of scary for me. It was something that I just wanted him to leave alone. And I basically told him as much. And I didn't actually even read what he sent me.
Yeah.
I was just kind of asking him to drop it, to leave it alone, because everything was great. Everything in our life was good. Our family's good. We like the life that we're living. There's nothing we're trying to fix. There's nothing that we're searching for. So to me, I felt like there was a lot to lose and nothing to gain. So I wasn't very supportive. I just was kind of told him to leave it alone and let life be the way it is.
And how is that for you, Daniel?
Frustrating. I'm somebody that if I see something wrong, I'm going to call it out and I want answers for it, and like I said, when times are happy, when I'm happy, everybody's happy. When I'm mad, everybody's mad. And so wearing my shock and anger over some of these things that I was stumbling upon on my shirt sleeve, and her being my companion and my confidant and the one that I wanted to talk to about it, she's in the midst of, a pregnancy and is trying hard enough to keep it together through the emotional roller coaster that a pregnancy brings, that she didn't want to hear it, and so it's like, well, now where do I go? I can't talk to my wife. And it was a little bit of a separation that came between us at that time.
We weren't fighting over it or anything. Like we had discussed right at the beginning that it was not something that either one of us would let, break up our marriage, because our marriage came first. And we were both very clear about that from the beginning, that no matter which path the other person took, that the marriage was staying together. We wouldn't let that destroy us. But the problem was, like he said, here's this thing that he's kind of obsessed with at the time, and that's all he wants to talk about. And of course, I'm the first one he wants to talk to about it, but I don't want to hear about it. And I was already, being pregnant and stuff. The place that he was at the beginning of his journey, he was kind of a lot of frustration and anger and bitterness. And I'm like really just kind of a happy person. I'm pretty even keeled. I don't like a lot of negative emotion at all in my life. And so I did not want all of that negative emotion being thrown at me while I was trying to raise 4 kids and go through a pregnancy and whatnot. So instead, he just we weren't really ever really fighting about it. It was more just that he kind of withdrew to his corner and I withdrew to mine. But we did notice that there was more of a distance. I think we weren't opening up to each other and communicating the way that we normally do, because we were on such different pages with it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, real quick. I think I want to try and keep this episode to 2 hours, so we've got about 20 minutes left. If it's all right, Daniel, let's finish out your observations about working at the church. Okay. Try and do it in the next 20 minutes. And then we'll do a third part, which will be sort of your guys' journey, out of the church, or your loss of faith, or whatever that is. So let's jump back and take us through the rest of your time at the church.
Okay, so one of the things that really kind of brought some, I think, anxiety in both of our lives was shortly after I went to work at the church, they went through the lowering of the missionary age to 18, right?
Okay.
And I don't specifically know that it was a direct result of the lowering of the missionary age, but I do know that there was a huge influx, and I think everybody knows that, a huge influx of missionaries that went out into the field. Like quadrupled the mission force out there or more. And I don't think the church expected that there was going to be that much of a change or a difference.
I don't think we quadrupled it. It probably went from maybe 40 or 50,000 to maybe 80 or
90,000. Yeah, you're right. It went to 80 or 90. Yep. I was thinking it was more like 20 or 30, but yeah. Okay. So it doubled, or whatever the case is. But in any event, I don't know that they expected and prepared for that amount of missionaries heading out to the mission field that quickly. Well, in order to support those missionaries, I mean, that's a lot of money. You've got the resources, you've got new apartments you have to hunt down, you've got cars, all the stuff that goes with supporting these missionaries out there. And it was kind of the standing deal that, yeah, we're in kind of a budget crunch right now to be able to support the influx of these missionaries who divert money over to support this. They're very tight on their budgets and where their money is allocated. And we had to go through our existing media budget and try to slash budget money that we had already been granted through the disposition of tithes, and it was all finalized and approved. And we had to go through and slash a whole bunch of stuff and give money back. And the understanding was it was to support the missionaries.
And your annual budget was about what?
In my department, it ranged between 16 and 19,000 or 19 million.
Between 16 and 19 million. Okay.
Yeah, for each year.
Okay. So, so big budget cuts.
Mm-hmm. And so then shortly after that, they start talking about layoffs. And I know my boss calls me in, and I had only been there, 6 months at most?
Yeah, probably.
6 months. And they're like, yeah, we're probably going to go through layoffs. And the only fair way to do this is to, give the seniority and so on and so forth. But I'm going to try to do what I can to save your job and this and that. So, I mean, nothing was set in stone, but I was all but under the impression that I was going to be laid off. And I was pretty upset because it's like I'm in the middle of building a house.
We had just relocated and left our other house to move here.
Yep. I had a great job at my other company, was making decent money and, so on and so forth. And I kind of felt like, you know what, I stuck my neck out there in good faith and loyalty to you. And it doesn't feel like you're going to be loyal back to me.
Okay.
Well, I mean, all said and done, I guess they were loyal because I ended up keeping my job and I was not laid off. So I look back and it's like, they did their best to take care of me. But also with the other thing that kind of upset me about that was that you're going to do layoffs to support these people who, a lot of them probably didn't save enough money to be able to pay for their entire mission. And so the church is going to have some responsibility to put forth money to pay for their missions. But not only that, these people are only in it for 2 years, and you're going to do layoffs of people who have been in it for years and years. And this is their livelihood, their career. They're all in, and you're going to value the people who go out for 2 years to do the missionary work over people who've given their entire lives to work for the church. And I was a little upset that was the decision that they would make, to lay people off. I will say, though, in their defense, they did everything in their power that they possibly could to not lay anybody off. They would move people to different departments, fill other open positions, even if you weren't fully qualified. They did anything and everything they could to keep the people that they have, because they understand and they don't want to have anybody go through financial hardships in any way. So while I was upset about that, I was very appreciative, and I know that no other company out there would take as good of care of their employees as what the church did for trying to keep the employees that they had. And understanding it's a business, and sometimes you have to make business decisions as well, and it kind of stinks when church and business get mixed, but it is what it is.
Okay. So during that time, just really quickly while we're on the topic of missionary work, you heard some speculation about missionary numbers. Talk about that really quick.
So we were talking, I think there had been some market research out there and some people who had looked and had realized and done the number crunching that the number of active members with children, age 8, primary age and whatnot, that are out there now are dwindling. And, small families are getting smaller, a lot of less active and so on and so forth. And what I heard was that within 10 years, the number of people on missions is going to be lower than what it was before the missionary age, simply because, there's just not enough members out there to be missionaries in the future. So the numbers were supposedly going to significantly drop, even with the lowering.
So church membership is shrinking.
Yeah.
At least at the younger ages.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then you talked about some interesting things you learned in terms of temples and temple work and temple names. Talk about that really quick.
Yeah, and some of that's some speculation, but I was at a retreat while I was working for the Church History, Family History Department for a day in Alpine, where the managing director, I guess you'd call him, and a couple of his people that worked for him came to that retreat and were talking to us because we were taking over all the production of their media, and they were talking about how they're excited to do a new look and feel for FamilySearch.org, that it's going to be super easy to find names of people to take to the temple, and the church is going to, in the near future, be doing a big push for family history work, so that people, instead of going to the temple and getting a name assigned to them, they will they'll be able to easily do their own work and take their own names of their own family members, and it'll be memorable for them because they're actually doing their own ancestry and their own, work for their own family. And so how great that was going to be. But one of the things that he said is that that he had been in meetings or talks or whatever the case is, and was told that the reason why this is occurring is because the temples are running out of names. And in the near future, it's going to be a requirement that all members, if you want to attend the temple, are going to have to take a family name because there just aren't any, there's not enough names to continue to keep up the amount of temple active, goers that are out there right now. And so that was one of the big things that they're trying to do, is make it easier for the members to find names, which it is now. If you go on Family Search, it's quite easy to find a name now. In 5 minutes, I can have 3 names to take through.
Okay, so there was a concern that the temples are running out of names. And then later you heard about the recycling of names. Talk about that.
Yeah, and that was much later after I left working for the church. That wasn't anything that I heard at the church, but there was a guy, and I can find the source of it again, if you ever want to post it, but you could probably Google recycling temple names. But there's a whole big deal out there where a guy kind of lost his testimony as well of the church because he was a temple worker, and he went in the first day he was there and went through and saw the big stack of names that they have, and went through and assigned out all the names. And then the next day he comes in, day 2, and he looks at it and he realizes it's the exact same stack of names that they did the day before, that they're redoing again. And then the third day, same thing. So 3 days in a row, they reused the same dead people's names that all these people were going in and doing the work for. And that was a big shock. And he asked, what's the deal with this? And they said, yeah, we reuse them because there's just not enough names to go around. So we'll do them for 3 days here, and then they get shipped off to another temple, and then we receive names from another temple, and they're just kind of recycling the names round and round through all the temples. And that kind of, when I read that, it kind of, and again, I don't know 100% for sure whether there's truth to that or not, but when I read that, it resonated with me because of the actual factual information that I did hear, that members in the near future are going to have to start taking their own names because the temples are running out of names. Okay. And so there was some correlation there that just really kind of resonated with me, that maybe there is truth to that. There's no actual fact or documents to prove that that is going on, but this guy's story seems to line up with what I personally heard.
No, I remember reading about evidence that someone had gathered that Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun had their temple work done and their sealing performed something like 8 or 9 different times. And it was disturbing to hear that Hitler had his work done, but I was even more disturbed to learn that it had been done so many times.
Mm-hmm. Anne Frank was another one. She had her work done many, many times.
Yeah.
So yeah, that definitely happened.
So I think over the past several decades, you probably have, on average, an individual being baptized having their work done between 3 and 10 times at least.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of wasted time for people, for members, going to the temple and doing all this work, when in reality, the ordinance work is meaningless.
Yeah. Yeah. And we can get into that in the next segment there. But for me, it really, there was a time when I realized that there's some stuff going on here that keeps people in the Mormon bubble, and temple work is a part of that. Regular temple attendance is part of the keeping you worthy, keeping you full tithe paying, full all in, bought in, indoctrinated into our way. And we'll talk about some of the other things that I kind of were eye opening to me about how they keep people in the bubble, later when we get onto those other sections. But that's something we definitely want to talk about.
Okay. So, so let's end by, if you're doing this work for CES around inoculation and correlation, if you're learning about all these difficult topics, were you involved at all in difficult discussions about what you should and shouldn't disclose? I guess you weren't involved in actual content creation.
No.
So did you ever see or hear or experience anything interesting around what details to share or not share with the Seminary and Institute students?
Some of the things, I guess one of the things that really kind of stood out was that when the correlation or editing department, whichever you want to call them, and again, my speculation, because I never actually met anybody on the correlation committee, is I guess technically what they called it on large projects, because they would get multiple people together on big manual rewrites and stuff like that. But I was told that the people that make up these committees are BYU professors, scholars, people like that, probably fair Mormon people and others that work for BYU or are Mormon scholars in some way, and they form a committee and probably go over each of those chapters. They get together, I don't know, once a week or a day or whatever the case is, they all get together and then they discuss, read out loud and discuss and make sure that everything's in line. So whether that's actually how it happens or not, or who it actually is, I don't know. But that's kind of the impression that I got, is that's the type of people that made up the correlation committee. And I'm assuming they would be paid for their work, obviously, employed by the church and are part-time or whatever it is, contract, but they know they are a part of the correlation committee, and they just contract as are contacted to do the work as they're needed.
So regarding your final months or years at the church, any other stories or experiences as you're learning about these difficult things and working at the church? Like what led to you ending church employment? Was it any of this stuff, or was it just a better job came along?
So I had another opportunity. I had several opportunities to kind of go back into the old industry that I was in, and I still wasn't yet at a point where it's like, okay, this is great. I'm going to take this opportunity and leave working for the church because it's not true, or I don't want to be involved in it or whatever, and I got to get out of here right away. It just happened to be that, a really good offer came along, and I accepted that offer and was really kind of sad about leaving working for the church. While I was still going through some of these things, I still had hope that, these things can be answered and not a major, huge deal. And it wasn't until later on, probably in 2013, where I really started going through, because at that point it's like I'm not conflicted now. I'm free to think a little bit more and be a little more critical of the church and not have to worry about it interfering with my job. But in terms of leaving because I had a faith crisis, that wasn't the case at all. Okay.
And so any other aspects or stories about working for the church that you want to include before we move on to sort of your journey out of the church?
I guess the last thing regarding the correlation type stuff that just kind of struck me is it was almost like a little bit of a battle back and forth when the seminary writers would write something and they had a manager that would kind of take all their stuff, right, and then submit it into the correlation department, and it would come back with the edits and the changes and all that stuff, and listening to the producer, the manager over the writers and whatnot, be like, I'm not doing that. I'm writing it anyway, or we don't care what you say, and kind of back and forth battling to get the stuff that they wanted, and some of it was because they didn't want the information out there in the way that they were presenting it. And some of it was because, these people want to leave their mark, like I write it and I want to say it in a particular way, But then there was other times where they're jockeying, like, oh no, somebody went and rewrote my entire paragraph and put it in their own words, and it makes me mad because I'm the one that wrote it, but they wanted to write it, and everybody's trying to make their own mark and leave their legacy in these things that were created. And so that was interesting to me. And the other thing was that when the scripture mastery cards changed, going all the way through the process of, each scripture book had about 10 to 12 scriptures that changed. And I had heard that we get all the way almost ready to go to the printing press, and then nope, we need to go back and pull this scripture and replace it with this one. And my understanding with that was there was some general authorities jockeying back and forth and pulling rank and seniority over who gets what, scripture mastery in the new scripture mastery, or maybe it was just the S&I leaders, but that some of the top people were jockeying over which ones should be there and pulling rank on the ones who wanted their favorites versus the senior ones who wanted their favorites. And so that project kept going start, stop, and change, and just seeing all these guys jockey back and forth and pulling rank on each other to try to get their favorite scriptures in the new Scripture Mastery remakes. So It's kind of fun.
Okay. So your final reflections on working at church headquarters, or what?
Really no complaints at all. I absolutely, for the time that I was there and as a believer, I personally loved it. I just felt like I was secure for the most part once those layoffs kind of, left. I just felt like I was secure. I felt like I was taken care of. I know that the severance packages that they offered for those that they did lay off were far better than any severance package that any other corporation would ever offer an employee. And I felt great, about my time there. And when I left, I actually was a little bit concerned that whether or not I made the right choice to go back into the private sector, because our family life was so great. Everything around that was just very church centered and very family centered. And I was very worried that all of that would dissolve, moving away from working for the church.
And so if you were to sort of, talk to members about how comfortable or uncomfortable they should feel about how well the church is run, it sounds like you're saying that the church is actually pretty well run based on your experience.
Yeah, there's a lot of red tape in areas, and I think maybe my personality type helped me get around a lot of that stuff, because there's a lot of people jockeying to use the same resources, and they can only do so much. And so my way around that was going to the person that I needed to have do something for me and tell them, I'm scheduling a meeting next Thursday at 2:00, and I need you to be there. And we're going to give a status update on this, whatever you're doing on your part of this project, to the stakeholders. And I want you there personally reporting on it. And then they're like, oh, crap, now if I got to be there and stand in front of the S&I directors, I better make sure my work is done. And so I kind of put people on the hot seat a little more instead of submitting it into the black hole. And then when they get to it, they get to it, and not having any end dates. So if you followed their processes, a lot of times it seemed like you're submitting stuff into a black hole. But if you really kind of started owning your stuff and taking some personal responsibility and holding people accountable for it, which, a lot of people who've been there for 20 years don't like a new guy coming in and putting deadlines and all that kind of stuff on them. And I'm sure I stepped on some toes and whatnot, but overall, I think the S&I department was happy at some of the progress that they had seen made. But yeah, it all varies. I've heard some people say it's so disjointed, and there's people who have morale issues, and it's poor. There's no leadership, and there's none of that. But for me, I thought where I was at was really well done, and we accomplished a lot, and I saw a lot of good media produced to, go out and influence people's lives. So, my experience was, I felt like we were really making a difference.
Beautiful. All right. And AnnaMarie, your thoughts on your husband having worked for the church for a couple of years?
I actually had a really positive experience with it. When he came to me and said he had the other offers, I was very, very torn, because everything from the time that we moved here to that point had been positive changes in our lives. And I felt like I was a little scared to rock the boat, which is typical of my personality. I don't like to rock the boat in any way. But so he came to me and asked kind of what my opinion was about it. And, a lot of prayer and a lot of thought, and felt pretty strongly that it needed to be his choice. It was what he was going to be doing day in and day out with his life. And so I just went to him and I said, I support you in whatever decision that you make. Just keep in mind that we've seen a lot of positive changes. And if you decide this is a change that you want to make, that we focus really hard on, making sure things are still moving in that same direction. And I think I cried more when he left and switched jobs than he did, because I had seen, going from a super high stress career over a lot of years to that, I had seen some really positive changes in him as a person. And so it was a little bit scary for me. But I wanted to support him in whatever he wanted to do with his life. So
sure.
And for me, this is double my pay. And it was all about dollar signs at that point. It's like, I loved working for the church. I learned a lot. I feel like I felt like at the time, it's like it gave me the foundation that I need now that I had lost somewhere along the way to go back out into the private sector and still be a good Mormon and be able to keep my values and do all that, where maybe somewhere along the way I lost that. I felt like that 2+ years gave me that foundation again, that I can go back and do that. Okay. Even though I'd started, struggling with some of the concerns and whatnot.
Sure.
And I felt like, man, those dollar signs are there, so let's go do it, and I felt like everything will be okay. And that's why I think we ultimately made the decision.
Okay. So this has been great. We've done a couple hours on your time at the church, and what we'll do is we'll close out this episode, and then what we're going to do is have a final episode. I'll ask a bunch of questions that the listeners wanted to know. We'll do kind of a Q&A, and then we'll end talking about your time, your kind of decisions to kind of separate from the church. Does that sound all right?
Yeah, that sounds great.
All right. Well, I want to thank Daniel and, were you going to say something?
No, I just said I'm excited.
Okay, so I want to thank Daniel and AnnaMarie for these 2 hours. Thanks, listeners, for listening. Check us out at mormonstories.org and join us for our final hour to talk about a Q&A and what led Daniel out of the church. So we'll talk to you guys soon. Thanks so much, everyone.